Well, tonight, I want to welcome you to my parlor as opposed to my library. I'm taking my ease this night as I look back over the shoulder and think out loud with you about Sam Clemens, or you may know him better as Mark Twain, the author. Our paths first crossed in the winter, I believe it was December of 1866, and I don't remember it. I was in a receiving line shaking hands, and Mr. Clemens, who was not yet at that time Mark Twain, he had adopted the name Mark Twain, but had not gotten any great fame yet. And in fact, he'd just done The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, which was his first success as a writer. And we had the perfunctory handshake and then murmured something innocuous to him, as one does in receiving lines, and he moved on. The next time that I saw Mr. Clemens was on July the 8th of 1870. And I remember that date so easily, it comes to tongue so easily, because he's reminded me of it a number of times, teasing me and tweaking my memory a little bit. But he had come to Washington City and was lobbying actually for some legislation in Tennessee. He had been in Washington City on a number of occasions since '66 as a lobbyist and doing work for various newspapers and periodicals where he would interview members of Congress and other notables who were in Washington City. And he was there in July of 1870 with Colorado Senator Thomas Stewart, or William Stewart. And Senator Stewart saw Clemens in the lobby of the Willard Hotel and said, "I'm going over to see President Grant. Would you like to come?" And Mr. Clemens said, with alacrity, he said, "Yes, I would like to come and meet President Grant. We've met before, you know." He always liked to get that in. And they came to the executive residence, and they were ushered into the office, and I was behind my desk, and I got up immediately to go speak with Senator Stewart of Colorado and shook hands with him. He said, "Mr. President, I'd like you to meet an up-and-coming writer, and he had flaming red hair, and said, "This is Sam Clemens, and his pen name is Mark Twain." And I extended my hand and shook hands with Mr. Clemens, and Mr. Clemens, in later laughing about this meeting, said, "My mind went blank and I couldn't think of anything to say. I was talking to the President of the United States and couldn't think of a word to say." Finally, after a pregnant pause, he was able to stammer, "I'm embarrassed, Mr. President. Are you?" And he described that amused me, and I grinned a bit just around the corners of the mouth as Clemens described it. He said he broke the slightest of a smile, which would have done a cast iron image credit. And then he said, when I said nothing, he said I beat a retreat under a cloud of cigar smoke that he had exhaled. I didn't see Mr. Clemens again until the summer of '79, fall of '79. Julia and I had come back from what became a 2.5-year round the world cruise and a tour, and coming back to Washington City, actually coming back intentionally to either Philadelphia or New York, where we had been given homes. We were given homes in Washington on I Street, Philadelphia, and New York. And trying to make up our minds where we were actually going to land. Stopped at the Palmer House Hotel, which my son Fred married the daughter of the owner of the Palmer House Hotel. And I was going to speak at a banquet later that night. And Mr. Clemens was there. Now, there were several thousand people that had gathered in the square outside of the Palmer House Hotel, very large hotel. And the manager of the hotel and the mayor of Chicago escorted me up to a room that had a balcony overlooking the square below and all the gathered people, much like the Pope and the Vatican coming out to meet the people. But Clemens, when I was brought in the room, he was out on the balcony. And he's waving and doing and bowing, doing this to the crowd. And the owner of the hotel, manager of the hotel, called him, Mr. Clemens, could you come in here? So he stepped off the balcony back down into the room. And the manager said, Mr. Clemens, I have someone I'd like you to meet, the president of the United States. And I was standing there with hand on lapel looking at Mr. Clemens. And Mr. Clemens said he had two feelings. He told me later, because we have come to be great friends. And he is able to tell me what he was thinking at the time. And he said, I had two simultaneous feelings of great dismay and great enthrallment. I was dismayed when I was introduced to you because I realized all those people out there weren't there for me. And I was enthralled because I had an opportunity to meet you and actually speak with you a moment. And I was listening to this. And when he got through making his nervous introductory statement, I extended my hand and he took it gratefully and we shook hands. And I said, I'm not embarrassed, Mr. Clemens, are you? And he took note of that. He said, 9 years later, and the first thing out of your mouth is a rejoinder to what I had said when I beat a hasty retreat from your office that July night of 1870, and you'd only been in office a brief time. Now, going back to the war, there are those who like to romanticize and talk about us actually fighting each other. That's bunkum. Now, we were in the same area at about the same time. Clemens had joined the Marion Guards, and they were Hannibal, Missouri, his hometown. His home is still there. I urge you to go visit it. Hannibal, Missouri is a wonderful place to visit. Much history about Mr. Clemens, and a very pleasant river town, too, there on the Mississippi. But he had joined Marion Rangers, and they were an irregular outfit. I tend to think very irregular. Not Confederate States cavalry, but irregular. And he was a second lieutenant. And he did that for 2 or 3 weeks. And he said, I finally, I grew much wearied of war, particularly the retreating. The war wasn't bad. It was the retreating that was killing me. And we did that the whole time I was in. And I decided that even though I'd done the retreat with panache and aplomb very well for someone who had no military experience, I nevertheless felt there's no future for me in this war. I don't think anything's going to happen. So he joined his brother Orion, who'd gotten a job as a secretary to the territorial governor for, I think it was Nevada. And Orion Clemens hired Sam to go out there with him. And Sam said he had to quit because Orion didn't pay him anything. The job had no salary. And he tried silver mining. That didn't work. Tried several other things. Nothing worked out. He finally got a job doing some writing for a local newspaper. And that is where his career began. And he found he had something of a way with words and a sense of humor, and began his career out there, moved to California, the California camps, met Bret Hart, Jack London, and other folks like that, and became a writer. In 66, he wrote The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, and that really launched his career as a writer and a humorist. Now, I was in Missouri about the same time when we'd moved in and chasing Meriwether, Jeff Thompson, the Swamp Fox, and I never came close to Clemens. In fact, I think he'd already gone by the time I got there, but I'm not sure. So I'd like to lay that myth to rest. Sam Clemens and I did not fight each other in Missouri. I will leave Mr. Clemens there for the moment. I went through the war, and you know what I did in the war. There's no need to belabor that. And I became president, served 2 terms. Now, when I took office, though, on March the 3rd of 69, I resigned my commission from the United States Army. And I did so for 2 reasons. First of all, I could have retired. I was eligible to retire. But to retire, I would have stayed on the rolls as a lieutenant general. And because of the command structure at that time, that would have blocked the next man, who was Sherman, from moving up. And I was going to appoint him general in chief to replace me when I ascended unto the executive residence. Staying actively or on the active reserve would have blocked that rank. So I resigned rather than retire. I'll never need the money, I thought, and no need to keep Sherman from stepping up, and then later Sheridan. So I resigned from the Army, and I took office. After I left office, I almost immediately began my tour. Julia and I went over to see our daughter Nellie and their 4 children. Edward Sartoris, the mid-level nobleman ne'er-do-well that she'd married, who actually, once they got married and the children started coming, he spent most of his time here in America on a farm in Minnesota. And he died a drunk in a hotel room in Milan, Italy, I think. But we had gone over there to see Nellie and the children. And one thing led to another, and we went from one country, went to over 2.5 years, we went to some 65 countries. Now, I was able to do that because I had made an investment in what became the Comstock Lode mine, and was doing very well with my investment there. And that was funding our trip going from country to country. Some of that trip, I traveled on United States naval military vessels. And the United States Navy is not in the tourist business, even for ex-presidents. But that's fodder for another evening for us to spend here in the parlor. Suffice to say, I did a lot of traveling via the United States Navy. And after 2.5 years, we finally wound our way back. We were on the ship Tokyo and sailed into San Francisco Harbor, then made our way across country, and we finally wound up living in New York City at number 3 East 66th Street, 5-story brownstone there, right across the street from Central Park. And I was casting about myself about what to do. Well, our second son, Buck, who is Ulysses S. Grant Jr., but he was born in Bethel, Ohio, and he immediately, as soon as the ladies attending Julia saw it was a boy, they said, "Oh, he's a son of the Buckeye State." And he immediately, before he took his second breath, became Buck. And Buck he was, and Buck he always will be. Julia tried to fight that. Don't call him that. We're going to call him Ulysses or Liz, like his father, but that didn't work out. So Buck. Well, Buck is our biggest son. He's about 6 feet 2 inches tall. He's our best educated. He went to Exeter, and then he went to Harvard, and then he went to Columbia. and got a law degree and was a very successful attorney there in New York City. About that time in 1880, 81, the Napoleon of Wall Street, Ferdinand Ward, met Buck. Now, Ferdinand had been quite successful there on Wall Street, became known as the Napoleon of Wall Street. He should have been known as the Scoundrel of Wall Street, and later worked very hard to gain that title. And he was a ne'er-do-well, a smiling swindler. Now, Buck was taken in by that, as were we all. Now, Ferdinand Ward proposed to Buck, let's form the Wall Street firm of Grant and Ward. And of course, you're the Grant. You are the Grant of Grant and Ward, intending, of course, all the time that I was going to be the Grant of Grant and Ward. And Buck was excited about it, as given what he was shown, given what he saw. He should have been excited. He was well founded in that emotion. And Ferdinand Ward said, let's talk to your father and get him to be a silent partner. Well, that appealed to me because I wanted nothing to do with business. I have demonstrated in the past that I'm not really good at business. However, working with a trusted advisor and businessman like Ferdinand Ward, I was very comfortable. He comes and speaks with Buck, brought him in after he talked to me about Ferdinand wanting to speak with me. Ferdinand comes to my home there, 3 East 66th Street, and outlines this plan. Scheme would have been a better word, but at the time it was a plan. And I was to be a silent partner and merely have my presence there at the office. I had an office on the second floor. I actually had an elevator to go up there, and would not be involved in the day-to-day operation of the business. And I said, well, now there's something that I must stipulate: no government contracts, none. And he promised me no government contracts. And immediately, once I got involved, started dealing with the government. But I let it go. And I spent a very pleasant next 2.5, 3 years there on Wall Street. Now, what Ward was doing was robbing Peter to pay Paul. And as he got investments to come in, he was buying more on the margin and getting more and more stock and bonds, but never paying for anything and living on a margin. But he was paying dividends early on. Now, I invested $100,000. Now, when I went to New York City, George Childs, who's a publisher in Philadelphia, became one of my best friends, got a number of businessmen together, 20 businessmen in New York City, and they got together $250,000 and bought me that brownstone as a gift for my services. Well, they gave me the $250,000. I put about half of it on the brownstone and put $100,000 into Grant and Ward. Buck put in $100,000. As I said, he was a very successful attorney in New York City. His father-in-law, Senator Chaffee, who was a millionaire from all the mines, Comstock Lode as well, out in Colorado, Utah, Nevada, multimillionaire, put in $400,000. Jesse, our youngest son, put in money. Fred, our oldest son, invested. All of my family and my 2 surviving sisters, all of them, everybody in the family invested in Grant and Ward. And I had so much money. We became part of the 400 social register in New York City, and which pleased myself and Julia greatly. I was giving Julia an allowance of $1,000 a month, which was unheard of. It we had it. I was a millionaire and greatly enjoying the life of a millionaire and rubbing shoulders with millionaires on a daily basis, and going down to Granite Ward and having a very large time meeting the titans of the business world. And I was meeting the titans of the business, the financial world of the world coming through my office. And it's noteworthy that in the fall of 81, winter of 81, Sam Clemens came calling on me there, and he had a good friend of his, author William Dean Howells. Now, William Dean Howells is a successful writer and lecturer, and he and Twain frequently toured together with the Chautauqua circuit and around the world, actually giving lectures. In fact, their last one that they did was Twins of Genius. Howells is giving intellectual topic lectures, and Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, is promoting whatever his latest book was, and he had quite a catalog by 81. And they came calling, and there were two reasons for that. Ostensibly, the reason that they came was William Dean Howells wanted his father to get an ambassadorial appointment, I think to Iceland, if I remember correctly. No matter, he wanted me to help use my influence with the president to get his father an ambassador appointment. And the other reason, Sam Clemens just wanted to show off people and prove I do indeed know General Grant. And they came calling. Well, we had quite the pleasant conversation, sitting there on the second floor, looking out the window on Wall Street. And then I did something, I thought nothing of it, but I did something that pleased both of them to their souls. I said, would you care to have lunch with me? Well, I found out way after the fact that for me to ask someone to have lunch with me was the pinnacle of society. If General Grant asked you to have lunch with him, you've arrived. I didn't think that way, didn't know it at the time, but I asked them to have lunch with me. And they were ecstatic. Well, yes, couldn't control their exuberance. And I said, certainly. And I had office boy come in, and I sent around, to their shock, I sent around to a restaurant around the corner and had them bring in my favorite meal, railroad baked beans and bacon and coffee. Now, Howells and Clemens were expecting something more sumptuous than baked beans. We call them railroad beans, and bacon and coffee. But that's my favorite meal. That's simple, good, hearty fare that I really enjoyed. Also kind of reminds me of being in the field, what I would eat in the field. So they sat there with me, and the three of us supped and had our coffee and baked beans and bacon, and carried on our camaraderie for another hour or so. Well, Howell's father got his appointment, and Clemens got his social credit by William Dean Howell saying, yes, Clemens does indeed can walk into General Grant's office and have lunch with him. I know, I did it. I saw it. And I didn't think any more about Clemens after that. Well, Clemens did say, as we were eating between gulps of hot coffee, he said, General, you need to write your memoirs. And I put the coffee cup down and said, no, 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 no. I'm never going to write a book. I was adamant. I will not write a book. And Clemens persisted, and he said, you need to write your memoirs. Look at all these people writing. Sheridan at that time had written his memoirs. Sherman, rather. Sheridan's going to work on his memoirs. Even McClellan is writing memoirs. Everybody's writing memoirs. And I told Mr. Clemens, no, I'm not going to write a book. I'm not going to add to the pile. All those other fellows can write all they want, and the pile gets ever taller. And I don't need to add to the pile. I'm never going to write a book. Well, what about what all you've done? I said, the most I'm going to do is write notes. I'm going to take notes about what I did as I think of them, and put together a notebook as it were, and leave my notes to my children, and they can do as they will with my notes. But I am not going to write my memoirs. Now, Clemens wisely left it at that juncture. So May the 4th of 1884 comes, and it's a Sunday. And early on Sunday morning, I get a knock on the door, and it's Ferdinand Ward. And unannounced on a Sunday morning, which was most unusual. And he was excited, frantic, and he said, Grant and Ward needs a check for $150,000. And I was set back on my heels, and I said, that's a great deal of money. When do we need it, and why? And Ward said, we need it today, or the bank, the merchant bank, Marine Bank rather, cannot open. And the Marine Bank, which is run by James Fish, who is I found out, in cahoots with Ferdinand Ward through Ferdinand Ward's father-in-law. But the money, I found out, was being funneled and covered up through the Marine Bank, and James Fish was the culprit there, working with Ferdinand Ward. But he said, we need it today, or the Marine Bank cannot open tomorrow. And I thought, where am I going to get $150,000 on a Sunday morning? Well, I did know somebody. I went calling, equally as stunning, to William Vanderbilt, not Commodore Vanderbilt, his nephew, William, who was, at that time, William Vanderbilt was the wealthiest man in the world. And we had become good friends. I went calling on him unannounced on a Sunday. He met me, took me into his study, and we sat down. He said, General, what can I do for you? There's something afoot, or you wouldn't be here now. And I said, yes, and I told him. And he said, well, General, and as he's in the drawer, pulling a drawer out and pulling out his checkbook and opening it up. And as he takes his pen staff up to write a check, he stopped and he looked across that massive desk at me, and he said, General, I've been hearing about things on Wall Street about Grant and Ward. In fact, everybody's hearing about Grant and Ward. I am not surprised that you are here today asking me for this money. I'm surprised that you haven't been here sooner. I also did not tell you what I've been hearing because I thought it best for you to find out for yourself, but obviously you did not find out for yourself. But he bent down to complete the check. He tore the check out, got up and walked around that desk and gave me that check. And as he gave it to me, he said, General, I don't give a damn about Grant and Ward or the Marine Bank, but I do care deeply about you. So I'm giving you this check as a personal loan, not to Grant and Ward. You may do as you will with the money, and do not be concerned about paying it back. We'll talk about that later. And I gratefully took the check and went back. Ferdinand Ward was waiting for me. He had stayed at my home. Gave him the check. Well, needless to say, that's the last I saw of the check. And for several months, the last I saw of Ferdinand Ward. On the morning of May the 5th, which was 20 years to the day after Lee hit me in the wilderness there at the Rapidan River, I got on the streetcar and I noticed people looking at me and elbowing each other. And when I got to Grant and Ward, there was a large throng outside the door, shouting and cursing and swearing. Doors are locked. I went to the door. Buck saw me through the door, let me in, slammed it back shut. And we went up to my office and I asked Buck, obviously, what's the matter? Why are those people there and why are they so angry? And Buck said, we're broke. It's all been a sham. Ferdinand Ward has been swindling us and everybody else. We are absolutely broke. He had written a check at that morning at Marine Bank for $40,000. And the bank, they slid the check back across. The manager comes out and slides it back across the teller's counter and said, we can't honor this. And Buck, of course, asked with incredulity why. And he said, you don't have the funds. In fact, Ferdinand Ward's account has $1,000 in it. And we were several $1 million in debt. We had gone bust. So I had gotten on the cars to come down the streetcar to come to work a millionaire. And I got back on the streetcar and went back home heavily in debt. In fact, about $1 million in debt. And I walked back in. Julia was surprised to see me. And I walked back in the room and she said, what's wrong? And I said, Mother, it appears we are broke again. And I went in my study and stayed there for about a half an hour. And I'm sure that Julia thought I was going to kill myself. But after about a half an hour, I got myself together and came back out into the parlor. And Julia, the only thing Julia ever said about it was she could tell I'd been crying. And I said, we need to pool everything we've got and begin paying this debt back. And the immediacy of the moment was the William Vanderbilt check for $150,000. We piled everything we had in the center of the room. I think we had $11 between us in cash. But we put all of my uniforms, swords, sabers, mementos from my military career, all of those gifts that we had been given for that during that 2.5-year round the world tour, piled everything into a small mountain in the center of the room. And the value actually came to, when it was assessed by William Vanderbilt, to $150,000, I think some $700 or $800. It paid almost exactly what I owed him. Now, Vanderbilt had immediately left for a extended European tour. And when he came back several months later, all of this loot is in his home, and he was greatly disturbed and a little irritated. He contacted me, and I said, I will not take it back. It's to satisfy the debt. He secretly contacted Julia through messengers and told her, I don't want this back. These belong to you and the general. I don't want them back, and don't worry about paying the loan back. I don't want it back either. And Julia said, well, and he said, I'm going to send it all back. And Julia said, don't do that. The general will be offended and angered. He is going to pay his debts. You will not send that material back. So Vanderbilt gave it to the Smithsonian. And that's where it all went. Now, I am casting about myself. What am I going to do now? If you'll recall, I don't have an Army pension, which would have been $13,500 a year. Remember, I resigned from the Army. I didn't retire, never thinking I'd never need that money. Also, I don't have a presidential pension. I don't know that they'll ever give presidents pensions. I don't know that they deserve them, but I didn't think I'd ever need one, so I didn't have a pension. I have no skills except being a military leader. I have no retirement, no pension. I am dead in the financial waters, and I'm $1 million in debt. And everybody in my family has been either wiped out or nearly so. because of Grant and Ward. I'm in a very difficult situation and no way to generate any income. However, I remember Century Publishing Company with Richard Gilder Watson, the senior editor, and Roswell Smith, the owner, and Richard Underwood Johnson. That sounds like such an official name, Richard Underwood Johnson. And he went by that name all the time. Young man, associate editor. They work at Century Publishing Company, and there is afoot with them a grand scheme. Now, let me say plan. Scheme has a negative sound to it. Ferdinand Ward has schemes. Century Publishing has plans. Century was wanting to do a 3-year series in their publication of Century Magazine of anecdotes and information from the participants in the war. And they enlisted men all the way to officers. Personally, I think the enlisted men would and non-commissioned officers would tell a better story, and I think they did, but they did want the leaders. And they weren't having much success with getting people to sign on, as I understand, particularly not the Confederate leaders and generals, but they had been pursuing me to write for them because they told me, and they were correct in thinking so. If we can get General Grant to agree to write articles about what he did in the war, then the other officers and leaders, and indeed enlisted men on both sides, are going to think, well, if Grant is doing it, then it's all right. I'll do it too. And they anticipated, which they had, a following of officers and generals that had previously turned them down, who said, yes, I will write for you. If Grant does it, it's all right. So I sent a note to them in June or late May, shortly after Grant and Ward and the shock had worn off, May the 4th and 5th. End of May, I sent them a note and said I should like to pursue with you the possibility of writing articles for your magazine. Well, they were ecstatic, and they sent young Richard Underwood Johnson out. And I was at Burlington, New Jersey on the shore, had a cottage out there, the 28-room cottage that George Childs had actually bought and was letting Julia and I live there. Now, we had bought it. I lost it. Childs bought it and let us live there. And I'm sitting there on the shore on the patio at the ocean, which greatly soothes me. And Johnson comes out to talk with me about writing articles. Had a very pleasant morning, lunch with him there. And my throat was a little sore because on June the 2nd, I was there with Julia, and we were in the pantry getting some food for lunch for the family out there. Some of the children were there. And I had a peach, and I bit into a peach, and I thought I had swallowed a wasp because my lower throat, I thought a wasp had stung me. I yelled in pain spontaneously. And I had to go drink a lot of water to try to cool that off or stop that pain. And Julia said, you need to see somebody about that. Well, Dr. DaCosta was visiting George Childs next door, a noted doctor, surgeon from Philadelphia. And I went over and talked to George, and he had Dr. DaCosta take a look at my throat. And Dr. DaCosta said, you need to see your doctor as soon as you can. You've got an issue in your throat. And which, Fordyce Barker in New York was my doctor, but he was on an extended European tour. So I saw him in October. But a few days later, Richard Underwood Johnson is talking to me about writing the articles. And they agreed that I would write 4 articles: Shiloh, Vicksburg, Petersburg, and Appomattox. And I'd start with Shiloh, do them chronologically. And they were going to pay me $500 per article, which was a huge amount of money to me and most welcome, because we had now for some weeks no income, and I'm living on the mercies of my friends. Now the servants are all gone. The $1,000 a month allowance for Julia is gone. We're comfortable. My wealthy friends were seeing to it that we weren't in want, but every day that went by, I'm not being productive to satisfy my debt. And $500 times 4 looked really good to me. And I wrote the first article on Shiloh. They got it, and it was as flat as the paper it was written on. And Richard Gilder Watson and Russell Smith told Richard Underwood Johnson, go back out there and talk to General Grant and see if you can't get him to liven up this article, because it's not good. It reads like a report, which in truth is what it was. I've been writing professionally ever since I was at the academy. I wrote all of my own papers. Every document that I issued as president for 8 years, I wrote everything. But everything I'd written since West Point had been for professional purposes and didn't have to be entertaining. Now I had to write to entertain as well as to inform. And Johnson was very, I want to say, cunning, without the usual negative connotation. Underwood was cunning. We're sitting there on the shore at the ocean, waves rolling in, having a light lunch, and he began asking me questions about this at Shiloh or that at Shiloh, and he got me animated, and I could smell the smoke and hear the roar and the screams and the shouts. I became imbued with the battle and excitedly began telling Johnson. And when I got through with a particular anecdote, Johnson leans across the table and he said, that is what you need to write and put on paper. Tell the people, write down exactly what you just told me. And I had, that was a view of the question I had not taken before. And I said, really? That's what you want? And he said, that's exactly what we want, General. That's what the readers want. And I said, well, I can do that. So he took his leave, went back into New York City, and I got pencil and paper and began scratching out the same battle with a different perspective. I think Johnson referred to it as the human interest. And I wrote it, some 20,000, as I recall, 20,000 words, very lengthy article, and sent that back into them a few days later. And the sun rose with them. They said, this is what we want. Now, I should like to point out to you at this time that when they put that out, the Century magazine, overnight, I mean overnight, gained 50,000 new subscribers. And they had added several more additional pages, full pages, to the magazine for all of the advertising that they were now selling, because the issue coming out, they said, next issue, Shiloh by General Ulysses S. Grant. Mr. Clemens, who's about to enter the story here, the narrative, Mr. Clemens did his research, and he's the one who told me they immediately jumped their subscription list by 50,000 new subscribers. They immediately made at least $100,000 more on that issue with Shiloh. And so I was on my way. I found that I liked writing. So this goes through the summer, and into the fall, into October, I'm working on my next article, Vicksburg. And Dr. Barker is back in town. I went to see him. He put the depressor in my tongue and looked, and he said, you need to go see John Hancock Johnson. Well, who is he? Well, he's a microbiologist specialist. He's the best in the world, and he's here in New York City. So I made an appointment. A few days, went to see him, and he did the tongue depressor and peered down into my throat, adjusted the mirror, that little round thing, and he looks in my throat, sat back, and I could see in his eyes what he was seeing in the back of my throat. And he took the tongue depressor out and set it down and turns around, and I said, "What is it, doctor?" "Well, we got to do," I said, "don't give me that minstrel dance about we have to do more tests. It's cancer, isn't it?" And he said later, he told me, I had a real decision to make, because I had to tell the general, I had to tell you the truth. I couldn't say, well, it could be this, it could be that. Because if I were to tell, in him giving the narrative, if I were to tell the general, I don't know what it is, or it could be this or that, I would lose his confidence when he found out it was cancer, epithelial carcinoma cancer. So he said, I took a deep breath and told him, yes, it is cancer. And I fear that it's ruptured and spread. It's cancer at the root of your tongue. I think he said epithelial cancer, and it is, I fear, inoperable. So I said, all right, say nothing to Julia. I will handle the matter. And I did. So he had taken some cultures of the base of my tongue and taken it to Frederick Schrady, who was the best throat cancer doctor in the world. I was fortunate to have such wonderful medical treatment there. And he gave Dr. Schrady an anonymous slide. And he said, take a look at this and tell me what it is. A few days later, he goes back. Dr. Schrady said, this man or woman has cancer, epithelial carcinoma, cancer at the base of the tongue, and it's inoperable, and they are going to die a long and painful death. And Dr. Johnson said, well, the patient is General Grant. And Dr. Schrady did not hesitate, and he said, well, then General Grant has cancer at the base of the tongue, epithelial cancer, and he is going to die a long and painful death. Now, he got on the medical team with Dr. Johnson and Dr. Barkley and Fordyce Barker, rather, and they were my medical team going forward. So with that, I go back home and tell Julia, well, I need to go. I start seeing the doctor twice a day, and he would swab my throat down with a cocaine mixture that helped at first, but then he had to keep increasing it to keep the pain down until I finally told him stop, because I can't write. It would cloud my head and I couldn't write. Well, I'd also thought about that time to go ahead and write my memoirs. The cancer diagnosis cemented that. I needed to do something that would generate an income for Julia, and it was indicated to me that I had about a year to live, if that much. So by the end of the season, going into the first of the year, October, November, December, I finished the first volume. And I'm telling then Century Publishing, this is going to be 2 books. And I'm working as diligently as I can. By this time, I brought in Adam Badeau, Captain Badeau. I met him when he was on Sherman's staff during the war, got him on mine, journalist before the war started, a very effective writer, good report guy, good detail man. And I got him and I got my son Fred to do details, fact checking, and going outside the home and coming back with information that I needed to continue to write. And I was hesitant about writing the memoirs because, you see, as I said earlier, I believe Adam Badeau had written a 3-volume treatise on Grant in War. In fact, he wrote a single-volume treatise after the fact, Grant in Peace. Grant in War trilogy went through the floor. It did not sell at all. And which is ironic because they're well written, they're very informative. Should you like to follow up, the 3-volume set by Adam Badeau, it's very informative. It drags in places, but to learn what I did from an inside point of view, they're good. Adam Badeau trilogy on Grant in the War. And I didn't want to walk on the sales of his book, but the need for the sales of my book became predominant, and I called him in to help me write them or to help me do fact checking. And I finished the first volume and began working on the second volume going into the spring of '85. Now I'm getting more and more ill, losing weight because it became almost impossible, and then it became impossible to swallow. One particular night, I went into spasms and choked, and Dr. Johnson gave me a shot directly into the veins of whiskey. And that when that hit, it straightened me out, and I got the coughing under control. Began writing some more. I got depressed. I didn't write for several weeks. And then on April the 1st, because my throat was closing up, I had a goiter, a tumor the size of a grapefruit on the left side of my throat under my chin. And that's why I began wearing a white silk scarf to cover that massive tumor and keep it from my family. They knew it, but I didn't want them having a look at it. But on April the 1st, I had, because of my throat constrictions and the bleeding from the throat and the tumor at the base of my tongue, my throat locked up and I choked and I nearly died. Again, Dr. Johnson, Harrison Terrell, my manservant that was there with me, no, he wasn't a slave. He had been with me after the war, but he was right there all the time. He was a lifesaver. And Harrison got Dr. Johnson, who immediately came, and Dr. Johnson gave me an injection into the veins of brandy. And that straightened me out. And I was able to expectorate, eject the pulp mucus blood wad that had blocked my throat, and I threw it out across the room. And I was able to breathe again, and I was very wan, shaky for a couple of days, but I was able to get back to writing. Now, Clemens has come to me, and at this time, he began pressing me to write my memoirs. And I said, well, I've already talked to Century Publishing. This just made him. And he said, well, I would like to publish your memoirs. I'm a publisher. He had he called him his nephew-in-law. His niece had married Charlie Webster, and he had financed with Charlie Webster buying Webster Publishing. And he said, I'm a publisher now. I can publish your memoirs. And I said, no, I didn't want to write them, but I'm going to have to. And what I need to do, I need to stay with what brought me to the party. I need to let the first person who brought up publishing my memoirs, Century Publishing, to publish my memoirs. And Clemens said, au contraire, General, if you're going to go with that line of thought, I'm the one to publish your memoirs. If you'll recall, back in early or late '81, when William Dean Howells and I came to your office, remember? He wanted to get his father an ambassadorship, so forth. I said, yes, I do remember that. And remember, I pressed you then to write your memoirs for me to publish them. Remember? And I said, in truth, I do. You are indeed the first person to seriously approach me about writing my memoirs. But I'm still obligated to Century Publishing. They've got a contract. He said, what have they given you? What deal have they given you? The deal they gave me was to give me 10% royalties of the net sales of the book or books, and they guaranteed to sell 25,000 copies. But out of my 10%, I had to pay office costs, secretary, administrative work, publishing costs. And Twain is getting red-faced at this time and neck thickening. And he said, and how much are they paying you for those articles? And I said, $500 an article, very proudly, $500 an article. Clemens slammed that table with his fist and roared, and that's the descriptive word. He roared. They are cheating you. They're only giving you $500. That's no more than they would give a red Indian out on the plains who is unknown for his life story. You won the war, and they're only paying you $500. Let me talk to them. He got me 2,000 an article, raised them up. They knew what they had. They weren't telling me. And he said, you go back and tell Richard Gilder Watson and Roswell Smith, tell them that my offer to you is that I will give you either 20% of the total net sales or 70% of the royalties. And out of my fourth or so, the remainder, I will pay all the publishing costs. So 20% of the net sales or 70% of the royalties. And I'll guarantee that we'll sell 100,000 copies. Now, if they don't meet that agreement, come back and let's talk some more. I went back and told them, and Richard Gilder Watson actually laughed. He said, nobody is going to sell 25,000 copies of anything, even if you write it, General. No, you go back and tell Mr. Clemens that maybe you need to go with his offer. Now, he gave me a contract, and I gave it to George Childs, my financial advisor. And George reviewed it, came back to New York City from Philadelphia, and he said, give the book to Mr. Clemens. That's a good deal. And Clemens said, which do you want? I said, I'll take 70% of the sales, because I still don't want to do this because I've known financial difficulties. I will not let somebody else lose money on a book that I've written, because nobody is going to want to read anything I've written. I will not. I refuse to let you lose money. Clemens is a good salesman. He came right back. He said, but General, perhaps you're not aware, but all of my books have been sold by subscription. Perhaps you did not know that. You could not buy a new Mark Twain book in a bookstore anywhere. All of his books were sold by subscription. That means, as he went on to tell me, General, no book is printed until it's already been bought. So I run no risk. You run no risk of me losing any money. We'll sell them by subscription. And you can I opted to take the 70% of the profits, not the royalties. And he said, I guarantee we'll sell 100,000. And I I signed the contract with Sam Clemens. Now, Sam Clemens he then put out the call across the country, and he was for salesmen, and he was looking specifically for GAR members, old vets. And his sales pitch to them before they went out, there were 4 different bindings that you could get from $2 to $20, lambskin leather. He said, you needed the general during the war. Now the general needs you. Go forth and sell. Orders poured in, and I asked him, sitting there on the porch at Drexel Cottage, McGregor Cottage in Wilton, New York, where I had repaired on June the 16th of 85 to get out of the heat of the summer. I asked Mr. Clemens, he'd come visiting, how was the sales going? Do you think this is going to be a success? And Clemens laughed. He said, General, I've already got orders for 100,000 sets of your book. Your book is already a success. And I was very gratified. I knew then that Julia would be taken care of. And he said, in fact, I'm going to keep 3 printing companies going. He had 12 printing press companies and 7 paper producers, print shops. They were working 24 hours a day for several months. At their peak, they were putting out a book every second. And ultimately, I sold in the first 2 years, there were 350,000 sets of my memoirs that were sold. And it was the #1 bestseller for 1885, as was Huckleberry Finn nonfiction. So Sam Clemens owned Webster Publishing Company, which published the same year and thereafter recognized as the greatest nonfiction American book ever written, Huckleberry Finn, and the greatest fiction book, and my memoirs recognized as the greatest nonfiction book in American publishing history. Same company, both books, and they were the best sellers for the next 10 years. By February, my first volume came out in December the 10th of 1885. And my signature is on the frontispiece page of every book, but it's printed. I have many people tell me I've got an autographed copy of your memoirs, both copies, and I have not the heart to tell them, no, that's printed. And it came out in December of 85. Mr. Clemens was adamant that there's an 1885 publishing date. And then volume 2 came out in February of 86, and of course shot to the top of the book sales in America and in Europe. It became I think it became the bestseller in England and Germany and France in 1886, 87, and wound up being published in several different languages. But in February of 1886, Sam Clemens came calling on Julia and gave her a royalty check for $200,000. It was the largest and remains, it was the largest royalty check ever written. And then before the end of the year in 1886, he came back to Julia and gave her another check for $250,000. And that was and remains the largest royalty check ever written. Because when one considers, as time goes by, more people buying more books, when one considers the number of people who bought or in the market to buy my book in 1886, as opposed to numbers of people, even as the population increased. When you take the ratio of market to book sales, those two checks at $450,000 in royalties are the two largest royalty checks, and the 250,000, the largest royalty check ever written in publishing history. So Mr. Clemens did me right well by publishing my memoirs, and of course he was afraid daily that I was going to be carried off before I could finish it, and had indeed arranged for Fred to finish my book should I die before it could be finished. And he also did something else. My attorney, Seward, Mr. Seward worked with Mr. Clemens' attorney, and they put a clause in the contract that upon my death, that Julia would get the rights to my book for $1,000. And that would keep my debtors from jumping on the sales of my book and attaching all the profits from my book. And what happened when I signed the contract, Twain immediately actually bought the rights to my book for $1,000, with Julia being the beneficiary for it, and protected, before the book was ever published, protected Julia from never seeing any profits from the book. So I think at that time, I should bring my remarks to a close, and perhaps, Mr. Mobius, if there's anyone who would like to ask me a question, I should be very happy to answer them.
So Michelle says, sorry, I couldn't help myself. Most Americans don't closely follow professional or college sports. Oh, okay. So Jesse says, wow, that emerald robe is looking amazing, absolutely incredible. Truly suits you.
Well, thank you. I shall tell Julia. She picked it out for me and said, "Here, Liz, wear this." I said, "It's too casual." She said, "Wear it." Yes, dear. So I'm glad that you like it. I feel quite the fancy, the dandy here tonight. I shall wear it again.
Barry says, with the amazing powers of AI, perhaps a man could be created for Michelle. And she thinks that that is creepy. Jesse also says, does anyone else worry artificial intelligence is playing God? And we are going to go past that. Mike says, wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And Jerry says, was Ward prosecuted for his terrible deeds?
Oh, yes. But Ferdinand, when I gave him the check for the $150,000, he got the money and skedaddled. He went actually down somewhere in the Caribbean. He stayed there several months and was captured, brought back to New York City out on bail. And actually, on May the 27th, that scoundrel came knocking at my front door. And Julia answered the door and was astonished to see Ferdinand Ward standing there. And he said, with his hat in his hand, "I would really like to see the general." And Julia, right before she slammed the door in his face, said, "No, I don't think the general will see you," and closed the door. Came back in and told me who it was. And I said, "Good, because I have no desire to see Ferdinand Ward." He wound up doing I think he did 3 years. He was sentenced to Ossining Prison, better known as Sing Sing, Ossining, New York, and did 3 or 4 years, as did James Fish of the Marine Bank. Both of them got out. Both of them didn't do anything, disappeared as far as I know after that. But he did actually come back calling on me.
Jerry would also like to know if Ward appeared in your memoirs.
No.
And he also says, what a sad story for a great man. Mike would like to know, how many grandchildren do you have, and did you live long enough to see all of them? And he follows that by, did they visit while you were writing your memoirs?
We had a gathering there, a coming together when I was at McGregor Cottage in Wilton, New York, and I urge all of you, go visit the Grant Cottage. It's a National Historic Landmark site now. It's 8 miles, I think 8 miles north of Saratoga Springs, New York. And it's a wonderful, wonderful place to visit. Please go there and enjoy. Everything in the room where I died is as it was the day I died. Even all the floral arrangements that were sent, one from Queen Victoria, is still there in the adjacent room. The bed I died in is there, which actually is a fold-up bed. And it's all there. Please go visit. Nellie had 4 children. Fred and Honore had, I think, 2 children by that time. Buck and his wife had, I think, 2. There were some 8 or 10 grandchildren that were there at the cottage those last few days leading up to July 23rd. And I don't remember anything after July 23rd, so I guess they were there after that. But there were a number of grandchildren. There's quite the family portrait photograph taken of us on the steps of McGregor Cottage. There are several that you may look up at your leisure. But we had a number of grandchildren that were there.
Michelle says they often say that good writers are first good readers. Are you a reader, and what kind of things do you enjoy reading? And did you read during the war?
I have always been well, my classmates at West Point described me as a voracious reader. I've always read widely. I like to read novels. I like history. I like Phoenixiana, George Derby, who was one of my classmates he became an even greater humorist than Mark Twain before Twain became famous. But George died in 1861. He wrote the book Phoenixiana, like Phoenix arising from the ashes, Phoenixiana. And was my favorite humorist. But I read humor. I like to read novels, as opposed to General Lee, who warned his daughters not to read trashy novels, that they will spoil your mind and waste your time. Another area where General Lee and I diverge in our opinions. But I read widely. I read during the war when I could. I also like to read Bulwer Lytton. I like to read James Fenimore Cooper, Joseph Conrad, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and other authors that were popular when I was reading. And occasionally during the war I could read. Didn't get to read much during my presidential administration, but yes, I read, and I read widely and as deeply as I can.
Jerry says, I had a version of Grant's memoirs, which were very readable. I gave it to Curt when he visited our home a couple years ago. He didn't have that version. What an honor to have Curt visit in our home.
Well, thank you. It was an honor for me to be there.
Richard asked, did Sam Clemens also pen an introduction to your memoirs?
No.
Whoa.
He did not. And I do not intend to be terse. No, he didn't. I would like to point out, though, that reminds me of the many versions and there are many versions of my memoirs. Century Publishing Company, Watson, Smith, and Johnson, all 3 were, of course, disappointed that I did not have them publish my memoirs. And they were gentlemen about it. They were a little irked, but they kept it to themselves. They did, however, several years later, get in on the bonanza, they published, Century Publishing Company, a version of my memoirs that have annotations by my son Fred. And the annotations are in the margins and they're printed in there where Fred made comments about the text. And I'm fortunate enough to have gotten a copy of those. I would urge you, anyone who is interested in pursuing the memoirs, there are two versions that one that you must have, the other would be good to have. The first one is the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library annotated personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. The Presidential Library several years ago put out the annotated version. Harvard printed it. It's in its third or fourth printing now. And John Marslake, Dave Nolan, and Louis Gallo working there, all three great guys, did an extensive annotation version. And in it, they identify every person, place, and event or thing that I reference in my memoirs. You get as much book in the annotations as you do in the text. Excellent, excellent book. Great to have on your bookshelf. If you're here tonight in the parlor with me, you're interested enough to get the presidential version. And it's the version that's got me and all my generals writing in a very structured portrait, Grant and his generals. The other version that you might want to get to see what Fred had to say would be the Century Publishing version that's got Fred's annotations in the margins. Very interesting what Fred had to say about what I had to say.
Dallas said, I found this presentation to be very interesting. Thanks, or many thanks to the General.
Thank you. Glad you're here.
Jim says, bravo, General Grant. I really enjoyed this program.
I'm glad. I enjoyed doing it.
And Mike says, President Grant, I read your memoirs last year, and I want to read it again. Loved it.
Well, get the presidential annotated version. If you read them again, you'll get much more out of it.
Michelle says, you may be interested to know that in 1882, a man was born who became famous for the kind of scheme you fell for. His name was Charles Ponzi, and he did the worst of his deeds in the 1920s.
Well, he and Ferdinand Ward ought to get along where they are, and if I could get it to them, I'd send them both a fan.
George says, dear General Grant, excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
James says, what papers, notes, or sources, if any, did you consult as you wrote your memoirs?
After battle reports of my peers and the enemy, the Confederate versions, what had been said by people like Badeau. Horace Porter wrote an excellent book, Campaigning with Grant. Copay, one of my classmates at the academy, wrote an excellent book. So I would look at books that were written by my contemporaries and the after battle reports of generals on both sides.
Bill Miller says, we just witnessed a narrative exceeding an hour with no hesitations, with many names and many dates. And it was just like we were sitting around the parlor listening to the general as if we were hearing him speaking in real time.
Thank you, Bill. That's very kind of you.
Very true. And Emily says, did Horace Porter fact check your memoirs prior to publishing? I read that Porter's young daughter would accompany him while visiting you, and you were so kind to her. Thank you for your wonderful program.
Horace did fact checking as he went along. The best answer I could give to that, it certainly wasn't an aggressive fact checking, but thorough. And he helped with fact checking, and I appreciated any observations he had to make.
Michelle says, I think that Ward and Ponzi are in a place where the bacon is very crispy.
I fervently hope so.
Emily also says, I won a silent auction bidding on your first edition memoirs at my library in Redlands, California. What a gift.
If you've got a first edition, best hang on to them
All
or
right.
donate them to the library, the the Lincoln Library, perhaps.
Yeah. So, you mean the shrine?
Indeed.
All right. Other questions or comments? We're getting applause.
Ah, thank you.
We're getting hearts. Thank you, Michelle. And Mike's clapping with alacrity, as is V and Sue Ann. And well, President Grant, let's let that be the final remarks. Thank you so very much for being with us tonight and talking to us about Mark Twain.
It's been a pleasure. I always like to look back down the halls of history and spend time with folks here in my parlor. I'm glad you saw fit to join me. I look forward to you joining me again when President Grant does his reflections on people, places, and things in his presidency and afterward. Good night.
All right. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us tonight and have a great weekend. Good night, everyone.
Good night.